Yo ho ho! Welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I hope you're keeping well. So I'm going to do my last wrap up of 2023. These are the books that I read in November and December, and my reading really slowed down towards the end of 2023. I only read 4 books in each month, but at the end of the day, I suppose it doesn't really matter because I did end up going over my reading goal and reading more than I expected to do so. So yeah, let's get into the books that I read in November. So firstly, I read a short story collection. I read Salt Slow by Julia Armfield. I picked this up at the library because I had recently read Our Wives Under the Sea, which is this author's first full-length novel, and I absolutely loved it. And I was curious about her short story collection and wondering whether it would have kind of similar themes and similar vibes. Because I've said time and time again on this channel, I am really content with reading the same thing over and over as long as it's something that I love. This collection mainly focuses on women's stories and exploring their experiences within society, within love, their sort of introspective views on things. And I have to say that my favourite short story from this collection was The Great Awakening. This is a story that since I finished it, I have been thinking about on the regular ever since. Like, I feel like this short story could have been a full-length novel if the author wanted to do so. I feel like she explored so many avenues with it. What happens in this is that our main character suffers from insomnia, and what happens is that her sleep physically leaves her body and is walking around and doing its own thing, and it turns out to be somewhat of a virus, and it's mostly centered around the cities where people just stop sleeping and their sleep leaves their body, and their sleep is really this kind of like animalistic representation of them. It explores what life is like without sleep when you have the full 24 hours of the day to yourself, and I just absolutely loved it. If you're like myself and you really enjoy reading short story collections, I certainly recommend that you check this one out, especially if you enjoy the themes of like obsession, isolation, women's roles in societies, kind of reflective, introspective sort of thoughts, and surreal literary fiction. This is definitely the one for you. The next book that I picked up was Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. I decided to start here with the series as this was the first one published, but from what I can tell, you can start anywhere in the 4-part series. It doesn't really matter. It does follow the Owens family through different generations, but they're not inherently linked with one another. So this follows the 2 Owen sisters, Gillian and Sally, as they're growing up with their unconventional aunts in a town in Massachusetts. And for centuries, their family has been believed and blamed to bring bad luck to the town. They really only have each other to hang around with, and this ultimately makes their sisterly bond a lot more powerful based on the fact that they're really kind of isolated from everyone else. So we have Gillian, who is sort of the free spirit of the 2. She basically goes wherever her heart desires, and she doesn't have a whole heap of luck within the romance department. Sally, who is the complete opposite to Gillian, she's much more straightforward. She's very focused on having a family and just maintaining the status quo. But ultimately she ends up losing her husband, and Gillian has her own problems that forces her back to the family home, and the sisters are once again together, forced to kind of sort out each other's problems and be there for one another. It definitely is more of a character focused book than a plot focused book. We do have like a darker sort of overarching plot to it, but I wasn't really all that invested in it. But nonetheless, I still really enjoyed it. I think I will slowly but surely work my way through the rest of the series. Whenever I need something that's a little bit lighter, or I need a little bit of a break from reading kind of darker things, I think maybe that's when I would be pushed to pick up another book in this series. Then I picked up What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is a reimagining of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, and on the tails of watching Mike Flanagan's adaptation of that on Netflix, I just really, really wanted to read something with similar vibes to that, and so I picked this up. And I was lucky enough to get this edition in Chapter's secondhand section because I really, really wanted to find this hardback edition. This is the US edition because I really didn't like the European release of it. Part of me was like, oh, I want to read it because I think it's going to be good, and I've read some T. Kingfisher in the past and I'm interested in it, but part of me is also like, this was mainly like a cover buy and I kind of wanted to read it based on the cover, which is never really a great reason to pick up a book. But anyway, I wasn't disappointed by it, so let's just say that. So this follows our main character as they're requested to make an appearance at the Usher household. Madeline Usher is dying, and she's sent them a letter explaining that she'd really like to see them again. When Alex gets there and kind of realizes the state of decay that the house is actually in, realizes how sick not only Madeline is, but also Roderick, they really want to get them out of the house and, you know, have some sort of doctor intervention, you know, bring Madeline to the hospital. And Roderick just refuses it. And as Alex is trying to work out what's actually happening with the Ushers, they realise that maybe it's something to do with the land that the house is built on, as the animals that are roaming around seem to have been affected by some sort of fungus mutation. And the description of the rabbits in this, or the hares, is really creepy. There's like one particular line about how they move, and it just really kind of gave me the heebie-jeebies. There's just a whole heap of mystery to this, and I feel that with especially the particular length of this novel, it just really did deliver on those sort of gothic vibes that I really, really enjoy. And I'm really looking forward to picking up the second book in the series. And if you're someone who's interested in getting into reading the gothic horror genre, I think this would be a great place to start. Not only is it referencing something that is already in existence, and there's that kind of like vibe of like familiarity to it, it also brings a lot of new stuff to the table. So definitely check this out. Next, I read This Thing Between Us. This was one of my most anticipated reads of the year, purely because I'd seen people really sing its praises, primarily over on horror TikTok. There was a lot of people who are really, really into this book, and I was really hoping that this was going to be a new favourite of mine, and ultimately it ended up being one of the most disappointing reads of 2023. Partially because I feel like it was kind of marketed as something that it's not. It was kind of marketed more as like a sci-fi cosmic horror novel, and even though it does have elements of that in it, it's not really at the forefront of the story. It's more of a grief-based horror novel. And I found that while I was reading it, I kept thinking back to Pet Sematary. And if you've read this book, you'll know why I was specifically thinking of that, because it has certain elements that are very, very similar to Pet Sematary. And I just feel like Pet Sematary did it way better. So this follows our main character, Diego, after his wife Vera passes away. And her death is really used and weaponized by local government as a way to talk about local immigration, and you know, it's more of like a right-wing sort of conversation that's been had. But even that specific aspect of the story I felt was really generic. Even the language around it I felt was incredibly basic. Diego ends up moving away into a sort of remote wooded area, and as Diego is getting settled into his new home and his new life, he realizes that maybe he wasn't able to leave his past behind him, or more so, his past hasn't been able to leave him. I just didn't feel the writing was all that strong. I didn't feel like the social commentary was really there. Horror has always been a way to use social commentary or to raise awareness to certain topics within society, and for some reason I just felt like what this book was trying to say just did not feel impactful whatsoever. I found it somewhat hard to follow at times and hard to envision, and that might just be my own particular issue with reading it. At the end of the day, I don't think this book was particularly memorable for me. The next book that I read was Brother by Ania Ahlborn. This was a spectacular horror novel that definitely focuses more on the dysfunctional family aspect than the horror or the gore, even though there are certainly some gnarly moments within this. So this follows our main character, Michael, who is 19 years old. He's a member of the Morrow family, who are this kind of weird out there family who live in this farmhouse in the Appalachian Mountains, and they're completely cut off from society. Their house is incredibly derelict, but they still live there. Basically, they're a family of cannibals, and Michael feels that he doesn't belong. He really wants to get out of this sort of life that he's somehow locked into. He's very much bullied by his older brother, and he just feels like he just doesn't fit in. On an off chance, he ends up meeting a girl at a record store, and he befriends her, and he realizes that maybe there is a chance that he can have a normal life outside of what he's been brought up to know and do. And it really is kind of like a tale of generational trauma, general dysfunction, abuse, all that sort of thing. And the way this book had an absolute chokehold on me while I was reading it, I couldn't believe what I was reading at times. And by the end of the book, I was literally shaking it and shouting at it because I was so invested in what was going on, and I was so invested in these characters and stuff. I feel like this was just a fantastic horror novel. It doesn't really focus super hard on the horror aspects. It's more so the horror of this family, the horror of their behavior, rather than the actual kind of blood and guts of it. And I feel like it just delivered all around on what I specifically want from a horror novel. I can't recommend it enough. Then I picked up Before We Say Goodbye, which is the fourth book in the Before the Coffee Gets Cold series by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. I have to say that as much as I've enjoyed the series so far, I really wasn't a huge fan of this book. There's only 4 stories in this particular volume, and they were all very reminiscent of stories that we've read previously. If you're not familiar with the series at all, it's basically about a cafe that you can travel back in time in, and there's a whole heap of rules and regulations that go along with being able to travel back in time, such as you have to sit in a particular seat, you have to have your coffee, obviously, before it gets cold, and there is a specific rule that you can only meet people who've already visited the cafe. And for some reason in each of these stories, those rules were explained to us time and time and time again. Even though it's the 4th volume, we're very familiar with how things work in this cafe. For me personally, the re-explanation of how the traveling back in time works felt like filler. It felt like it was in each of the stories just to plump them out a little bit. And I just ended up finding it really irritating. This was, not great, but eh. The next book that I read was another short story collection. It's The Things We Say in the Dark by Kirsty Logan. This is an author that I've heard about over the years on Booktube, but I never really got around to reading her work. And I did try and read this a couple of months prior to actually completing it, and I just found the introductory short story in this was very kind of like rigid, and it kind of drops you in it, and I had no idea what was going on. I had no idea. It's like, I made a house out of hair for you, and then you spilt something on it and it became a matted mess and you rejected it. I was like, what the fuck am I reading here? Like, what is going on? Why is this woman trying to make little houses out of various body parts? It's a story that didn't ease me into it, and I felt very put off by it. A lot of these stories focus on womanhood and motherhood in particular, and I found it to be an incredibly refreshing collection of tales, especially the stories that focused around pregnancy and what the human body goes through, and really internal thoughts and worries that women can have in these sorts of really kind of vulnerable moments. Also, what made me interested in picking this up in the first place is that this author's been compared to Angela Carter and Shirley Jackson. While reading it, I found that those comparisons were very accurate. I'm really glad to have finally read it and to finally understand it. And I'll definitely be picking up more of Kirsty Logan's work in the future. And finally, the last book that I read in December and the last book of 2023 was Our Share of Night by Mariana Enríquez. This was spectacular. Now, I will say the one thing that I feel like I really took away from my reading experience was the fact that I think I read it far too quickly. This is a book that I really feel like I rushed through in order to complete it by the end of the year. I didn't, for some reason, want to carry it into January, and I feel like I should have. I feel like I should have spent more time with it. So this story follows a father and son. The wife has passed away, and the father and son are trying to escape the wife's family, as they are this sort of like psychotic cult referred to as the Order. And the father is a member of the Order, and it's very much kind of explained initially that he did a lot of their bidding for them. He has this sort of psychic ability that they use, because ultimately the Order is on a quest for immortality. And I really enjoyed how this book delivered, because it wasn't one of these books that you start and it's, the last 20 pages that everything starts to make sense. There was these moments throughout it where something big would be revealed to you and you'd kind of get more insight, and it jumps around in its timeline quite a bit. But it all kind of made sense. Like initially I was thinking like, oh my God, a book that's over 700 pages long that's going to jump around in the timeline. Like, I feel like that's just going to be confusing to read, or it's just going to be a lot to take in. And it really wasn't. I will say the one thing about this book is that if you're going to attempt to read it, I think you really need to be patient with it. There are a lot of slower moments. There are a lot of difficult moments within it, because the father has his own issues. He's quite abusive towards his son. It was uncomfortable to read at times of how abusive he was, and just how scary the son's experience was with him, and the amount of trauma that the father was contributing on top of the actual plot that was going on at the time. It also had great social commentary in it, as Mariana Enríquez like always delivers on those aspects. It doesn't feel like in your face. It all feels very important to the overarching story. I always just feel more enlightened and more aware of certain things after I read one of her stories. So those are all the books that I read in November and December of 2023, and that is 2023 wrapped up now. It feels good to finally be able to focus more so on the new books that I'm going to be reading in 2024 and kind of, have a look into the year and, make reading plans and all that sort of thing. So if you've read any of these books, let me know, or if you're planning to do so, and let me know if there was any sort of surprises towards the end of 2023 for you, if you read any kind of 5-star books, 4-star books, stuff that you'd really recommend. If you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can always follow me on my Instagram and my TikTok. And if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to feel free to subscribe. It really helps the channel out. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.